Hello, I'm going to be talking about improving the security, stability and performance of your web applications with DataFlex 2021. First, I'll look at some new features that we added to the WebApp server that allow you to better configure your server-side end of things. The first feature that I'd like to discuss that we added is the option to select a specific Windows account for your web app in WebApp Server. So basically you can set up a Windows account and then configure a web app to run under that specific account. This allows you to fine-tune the rights that web app has on your machine, because it will only have the rights of that specific user. And it basically provides better separation when you have multiple web apps that are running on the same server. And of course you can use Windows authentication on SQL Server, and you might even be able to access network shares when you have a real user instead of run under a system account. I'll do a quick demo of this, and first I'll show you guys this tool. It's called Process Explorer, and in Process Explorer it basically shows a tree of all the processes that run on your machine. So here we see the WebApp server, and under the WebApp server we see two web apps that I have configured, WebOrder and WebOrder Mobile, or standard samples, and both of them are having two processes. If you look at the username column, we see that all of them are running under the system account. The system account is the default account under which the WebApp server runs, and if you don't configure a specific user, it will use this account to run your web app processes as well. Now if I go to the Web App Administrator and to the Web Application Properties for the WebOrder application, we see this new option, Windows User. And if you check the checkbox, you can click the Select User button, and now you can enter the credentials that you want your user to, your web app to run under. If you hit OK, it asks you to restart the web application, and hopefully it works. Now in the background we see the process is being stopped and freshly started, and now we see that the administrator also shows test was as the user. And if we go back to the Process Explorer, we see that now the web order runs under the test was user. So as said, this provides better security at your server end. There are, however, some requirements for the user account. It has to have certain group policies enabled. Log on as a batch job is one of them. Allow log on locally. And it has to have a functioning profile on your machine. We are working on a manual that will describe how to set up a separate user that has the minimal requirements needed. Some other improvements are in the SPLF area, and I'll just briefly discuss these. We now have two-way communication between the master server and the application server with SPLF, and basically the application server will now tell the master server when it's going to shut down, when it's going to stop. And this prevents error 500s from occurring, HTTP errors, because it's trying to send messages to a server that's not available. So basically this improves the detection of irresponsive servers as well. Another option that we added is to configure a maximum amount of processes per slave. You basically, when you configure a master-slave configuration, you configure on the master the size of your application pool, and then when it starts processes, for each application server, it will start a certain amount of processes, and it's determined by the wave ratio. So if you have one master that's one application server that's set with a weight of 2 and one with a weight of 1, and you set a pool of 6 processes, one will get 2 processes and the other one will get 4 processes. But now if you take one out of this pool, it will basically start all 6 processes on the one server, and that could cause this machine to overload. It can cause licensing issues with whatever drivers and things you might be using. And for that we added the option to also set an explicit limit of the amount of processes. So the max amount of processes is always respected. So it might mean that you have a pool of 10 processes configured on your master, but your slaves only allow 6 to be started. So that's Other improvements that we added is we duplicated the maximum concurrent sessions option. It was already available at server level, but now you can also set it per web app. And that basically allows you to ensure that one web app doesn't take down an entire server anymore. So basically you set a limit of the amount of concurrent sessions that this application will handle at the same time. And if it gets above that, it will just ignore all traffic that comes in above this limit. When working with web services and HTTP handlers, your sessions are really short, so basically it's the amount of requests that it can handle simultaneously. That's in practice what it means. Another thing we did is we improved the automatic reload logic. Usually you configure your server to restart the processes every 24 hours or around midnight. And before it would bring down the entire application, stop all processes, and then restart them. And that has a little downtime in the middle. Now it just stops one process, starts another process, stops one process, starts another process until it has refreshed the entire pool. And basically it does all of this without downtime at all. And the last thing that we did is we improved the logic for when an attach to a process fails. When a request comes into the WebApp server, it's going to assign this request to a specific process. When an error happens while this is done, the attach fails. And what it used to do is send back an error to the client. But usually this error is caused by something that went wrong before the request came in. It might have been a different session, it might be that something crashed on the server itself. We basically don't know. And if it finds out that something is wrong before any application code is executed, it will now go back, it will trash the process, and it will assign the request to the next process. So basically it will retry, I think only once, but that reduces the chance of running into errors when the process is left behind in an invalid state. So let's move on to the WebApp framework. On the WebApp framework, we also did several improvements, and one of the major ones is that we added a new security layer at the UI level. Basically what we found is that the WebApp framework does all security checks at view level. So when a call comes in and a user has access to a view, it will allow the call. If it doesn't have access, it will deny the call. But we found that there's also, of course, a lot of situations where a user has access to a view, but the developer has hidden parts of the view by setting PB_render to false. But then, using the developer tools, you could still mess around with those controls and see data that you shouldn't be seeing, and even access execute server code that you shouldn't be able to execute. So we added this new layer that basically, by looking at the PB_render, PB_visible, and PB_enable properties, just checks if the user is allowed to perform the operation that is about to be performed. It also stops communication between the data entry object and the data dictionary when a data entry object is hidden. We implemented this using a new web property type. We added a new web property type for this, and this is called the client protected web property. And the client protected web property is basically a client web property. So if you set the value, the value is sent to the client, so the client knows if it should hide or disable a control. But it also stores that value on the server in the WebApp server props table, like a server web property. And whenever you webget the value, it doesn't use the value that is coming on from the client, it uses the one that's stored on the server. So you can rely on this server, on this value, that it's not being tampered with. So it's a lot more secure. And it works like any other web property. You just say web property equals client protected, and now it's a client protected property, and you can just webset and webget it. This security layer has the following API. There is the allow server action, which is the main procedure that's called to determine if a server action should be allowed. Subclasses of CWebObject actually augment this procedure, and you can augment it, but you should always forward send it, or at least unless you know what you're doing. The CWeb base UI object has the logic for determining if a control is visible or not. So it implements allow server action, and it determines if the control is hidden or disabled. There's actually a little more to it than just looking at the web properties of the control itself, because it can also be that one of its parent controls is hidden. So if a container like a group or a tab page is disabled or hidden, all the controls inside it are hidden, so it has to look at its parent objects as well. Then for the data entry object operations, we have properties that basically control if a control will update the data dictionary with new values, and there's a property that determines if it will read values from the data dictionary when it's hidden. And there's allow fill DEO and allow update DD. These are the actual messages you want to augment if you want to customize this logic. What I would like to add to this security layer, it's also available for older versions in the form of the redaction library. So if you run on 19.1 or 19.0 and you're not able to update to 20 yet, you can download the redaction library and use that to implement the same checks yourself. Just when you go to 20, there is no reason to use the redaction library. You can just throw it out and rely on the framework doing it for you. And then the last thing I would like to touch on is that in DataFlex 20, the WebApp framework is not implemented as a web service anymore, but it's implemented as an HTTP handler. And the HTTP handler gives us a lot more flexibility in parsing the request and generating the response, because it's all done in DataFlex code. And it basically allows us to make the request and response format more dynamic. What we had to do when we were still using a web service was to have, when a control wants to send a complex piece of data to the client, it had to serialize it into a value tree and send that value tree to the client. A good example of that is the web list. The web list would send the rows to the client, the TWeb row structs, and to be able to do that, it would have to convert it to a value tree, which is then sent to the client, and on the client, that's converted back into the usable format. Now, it just sends a JSON handle, and the JSON handle just points to a JSON object that has the right structure. And there's also APIs that work with variants, where you can just send a struct, and that struct will just be serialized to JSON directly. And in case of the web list, this actually reduces the amount of data that's sent back and forward with around 30 to 40%. And that basically gives improves the performance, but it also improves the readability of the code, the data, and it simplifies things. So no more value tree in 20. The only thing where you actually see this change is if you open the web service dispatcher directly in the browser. So here I've opened the web service dispatcher.wso, and that's now not pointing to a web service anymore. It's pointing to an HTTP handler, and the HTTP handler just gives back this sample page. You can use this to test if you have configured your server properly, and it will tell you the framework version that's behind it. If you would do this with 19.1, you would get this web service description page, and if you click call action, you get the description of the message format. So you could also call it more secure, that it's not exposing the entire API here. So basically, the message is that we have made lots of improvements under the hood, and most of these you just get for free by just upgrading to DataFlex 20. And we have tried to make it, as painless as possible, because of course the Unicode and 64-bit conversion will cause enough pain. So you get these for free, and I think it's some really nice improvements that also show that we have spent time in other areas than just the main things in DataFlex 2021. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you again soon at one of our events.